Hi, I'm Somer Hackley,
And I am Zen Mac, and this is the Art of Search Hiring Manager series.
and these are stories and insights about all things hiring. Zen, good to see you again. Thanks for being here. All
Hello.
right. Yes, hello. Okay. Well, today I wanted to introduce you to our guest, Robert Sears. So, Robert is the Chief Product Officer at Accion Opportunity Fund. He's a C-level executive, he's an innovator, he's a serial entrepreneur, and he's been a CEO, a COO, a Chief Product Officer. He founded and grew one of the earliest consumer neobanks, as well as a SaaS platform for consumer lending and payments. And what I wanted to tell you about him is he's one of these rare people that he's visionary, he's execution oriented, he launches great products, but he also has this really incredible technical mind. He has a PhD in physics, and I've known him for over a decade, and I can't even begin to tell you how helpful and how kind he is. He always starts every conversation asking about my family, and
Oh,
he's for years he's been my go-to person for advice, recommendations, and also just his amazing energy, of course. So Robert, it is so great to see you here today. Thanks for joining us.
Pleasure to see you, Selmer and Zen. Really great to be here.
I'm excited to meet you. Thank you so much for being here. And I'm just going to jump right in. So, given
Please.
Somer's introduction, you've been a co-founder, you've worked in established companies. What would you say are some of the best practices that you brought with you from these larger enterprises to sometimes these smaller startups that may not have as much structure or infrastructure to support it, and then vice versa? Like how would you help someone through that transition, whether it's large to small or small to large?
Yeah, it's a great question, Zen. You really can learn from each of those domains and apply what you learned across. I've actually found I've learned more from the startup side than from the big company side. Partly because in a startup you have to do so much yourself. You
Hmm.
don't have any infrastructure to lean on really. But everything I've learned there really has been portable over to the large enterprises. And then you definitely find some of the other ways. So let me go through a few examples here. Um, Fundamentally, I think you have to treat recruiting and hiring as a first priority practice. It really is. There are all sorts of projects that you have going on in a startup and in a big company. A lot of demands for your time, but
Mhm.
if you don't spend enough time and enough mental bandwidth on hiring, you're not going to get it right. And the wrong hire is a disaster. You can easily see that in a small company because you have limited funds, limited runway, and if people aren't producing, or worse, they don't fit with the culture and they're negative. It's a big problem. But that's true also in a big company. So you want to be really careful and give it the attention that it needs. Um, Over time, I've learned, and by the way, I'll say I still find this to be a very difficult process. When you decide to take it as seriously as you need to take it, it takes a lot of work. And if you're not willing to do that, then you need to think hard about whether you're actually going to hire or not, because it could be a big mistake. Um, I think that what I've realized in small and large companies is you need to make sure a few things are completely consistent when you're setting out to hire somebody. You need to have a really clear picture of the role that you're hiring for. And one of the things that I found over the years in working with Somer in particular is that's part of what she'll do is she'll kind of pick at what you're saying, not in a bad way, but pick at what you're saying and say, really, let's peel back the layers. What is it that you're trying to do with this role? You got to have a really clear picture of the role. That needs to align. Surprisingly enough, this doesn't really happen. That needs to align with the actual activities that you expect that person to do.
Hmm.
In a Here's one area where startups and big companies typically different. In a startup, it's almost always all hands on deck. So you pick somebody for a role and you expect them to have certain activities, and that's where you hope they'll focus most of their time. But they're also going to have to do other things for a startup. In a big company, usually it's a bit more compartmentalized, but you have to make sure that the role that you're scoping out and the activities really align. It's really surprising how often that's not the case. Um, that also needs to align with the title. And especially in the startup context, you can have kind of funky titles and things like that. That's okay for external, but you need to make sure that the person and other people in your organization know what they're doing and what they're there for. And then the last thing is also a surprising gap pretty often. I've I've encountered this myself, and I've seen it in multiple angles. You need to make sure the job description lines up with all of these other things. So you need to know what is the role going to do? What are their activities going to be? What am I going to call them? And then how do I describe that to the outside world?
Totally. Couldn't agree with you more. And based on personal experience, I completely relate to the story about how do you define that role and having someone like Somer being able to challenge, not nitpick, but challenge the thought, right? You want someone to do
Right.
X. Let's define that. And what does that actually mean? In what context? And what size company? What size team? What kind of results are you looking for them to achieve? Have they done that before? Have they not? And in my own experience, what I've learned is that in startups, you may not necessarily have the time or energy to go through that internal, what I call leveling and laddering exercise. And so
Mhm.
what happens is funky titles happen. Oh, we didn't even consider this, but this person is now significantly more senior than what we were after, but we got to have her, or something along those lines. And that gets tricky when these systems are not in place as a startup. But I love what you said about you've got to have the mental bandwidth and the time bandwidth to hire. Otherwise, you shouldn't.
Right. It's just as important as laying out your corporate strategy and the investor presentations and things like that. You've got to view it at the same level, particularly if you're hiring for C-level roles or critical developer roles, things like that. Those are
Yeah.
indispensable people. You got to get it right.
That's all right. Speaking of, that actually rolls into my next question. Can you tell us a time where you successfully hired someone that really impacted your company's growth? Like, what was that process like? Did you plan for that? Did it surprise you? What kind of process led you to recruiting this amazing person?
Yeah, so I would love to say I planned for it. I can't claim that though. I planned to hire a good person, and I'll just be really upfront and say there was a lot of luck. Um,
Mm,
so what I found was I was looking for a person who had experience in the technical areas that I wanted filled, but also outside of that, so a bit broader knowledge base. But also, I was really, and this was earlier. This has happened to me a few times, but the example I'm thinking about was earlier. So I really hadn't settled on some ways to think about the hiring process like I do now.
mm,
And I knew I wanted a person with a good personality, somebody who was confident in their knowledge, but also humble, interactive when you speak with them, and not false in any of those things. Very, very clear. And then a person with enough sort of character to be the kind of person who would look at problems from different angles. And the person I found exceeded all that by leaps and bounds. I brought him in to be an architect, and he ended up having so many skills that I hadn't seen. But then once you look back on it, you're saying, "Oh yeah, I understand." And through the interview process, I could see glimmers of that. So I start looking for those things now. But to me, usually that is you make sure that somebody fits the role. You go through the things that we just talked about with the role and fit, but then you also look for how do they interact with you? Are they genuine? Are they willing to say, I don't know the answer to that in an interview, and
mhm.
I don't approach those things as gotchas. I
Yeah.
typically want to have a conversation with somebody. If they engage you in a good conversation, then you can start getting a really, I'd say, a more deep picture of what they're like.
Yeah. I think you're absolutely right there. I mean, one of the things that kind of come to mind when you're interviewing or you're talking to somebody is like the situation of like if you needed to fill a position really, really quickly, but you weren't super confident in the candidate funnel or perhaps the couple candidates that you interviewed, like what would you do if that situation came up? Like it's really
Well,
urgent, right? Yeah.
I can speak to that because I've been in that situation. And then what I typically like to do is, if it possible, hire them as a contractor. And
Mm,
I've had situations where I've done that, and I've seen those cases go both ways. You hire them on as a contractor, and what I like to do is I like to set a fixed time period for that. So say, okay, we're going to have this contract position for 6 months. The reason for that is during that 6 months, you can find out more about them.
yep.
And sometimes they'll surprise you either positively or negatively. But also with everybody agreeing to an end date, there's no expectation that it's going to go beyond that. So there's no awkward moment where you get to the end and you say, yeah, you didn't quite make what we need, so we're going to have to let you go. Also, your budget could change. You never know. Maybe you get to 6 months down the road, you can't hire them and you would. So I don't promise a hire up front in that circumstance. I basically keep a very clean contract where everybody agrees, this is what I'm going to work on. This is how we're going to do it. And at the end of the 6 months, odds are we're going to go our separate ways as friends. If they are really good and you have the opening and you have the budget and you can hire them, then everybody's happy. So it's better.
I like that. I like that you're solving for de-risking it while still being able to make a decision, like the
Right.
interview process on both sides, everyone's trying to de-risk their decision, whether it's the candidate accepting or the hiring manager hiring. Everyone's like, what information can I gather right now so that we all know this is the best path forward? So you found a way to de-risk that a bit. If the candidate's, of course, willing to do that sort of arrangement. But I think this world of fractional, it's really been
Right.
picking up quite a bit. So you probably have a lot more folks out there that are open to it, especially senior people. So yeah, I like that. And I wanted to comment on one thing you said earlier, which was people that approach problems from different angles and really having that versatility, because I've been thinking a lot about like what separates that candidate who gets the offer from the number 2 candidate or the number 3 candidate, because at that point they've interviewed great, they have the skills, and so it really comes down to that something extra. So that's a good takeaway for folks that are maybe listening with the interviewing for the role lens, is really just showing that you have that versatility or that player that can jump in multiple areas and you approach problems in different ways versus someone that has their one toolkit that they're looking just to implement the same way anywhere they go, right? I think that sets people apart, having that flexibility. So yeah, I love it.
Couldn't agree with you more. That also makes me think of one thing that I think is really important is as you're going through the interview process, you have to take pains to make sure that you share with the candidate what your organization is like and what the role is going to be like so that they can actually appropriately address without trying to hunt around and figure out what you're looking for. You want them to be able to actually address what you need and tell them about yourself. So you want to set them up to be able to give you the best impression, most accurate impression of who they are. And that takes that work that we talked about at the beginning.
Exactly. It's like what you said earlier. It's not about gotcha. It's about, no, let's all be
Absolutely
on
not.
the same page and make sure this is the right decision for everyone. Most candidates will self-select out, right? And say, you know what, that's not me. I've noticed.
Right.
So I love that. All right. Well, this was a great conversation. Thank you, Zen, for being here as always. And Robert, thank you for joining us. This was wonderful.
It's my pleasure. I really appreciate it. Thank you both.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks.